Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Matt Palczynski. I teach art history in Philadelphia at Temple University, and I'm very happy to be here with you today to talk about one of the greatest artists in the canon. Cézanne is one of the first artists that an art historian would meet in art school, and one of the artists that for many, many years, some of the most famous artists have been looking at. Today, we'll figure out what his work looked like, what some of the patterns involved in his work, what some themes we'll find throughout his career. And that all begins in 1839, when Paul Cézanne was born in Aix-en-Provence, a very nice place in the south of France. His parents are an interesting part of the story, and it's not always necessary to go back into the family history, but his parents do play a little bit of a role, as we shall see, especially his father. He's got a very complex relationship with his father. And from his mother, he seems to have inherited a passion for all things romantic. He's got two younger siblings, Marie and Rose, and he ends up staying very close in some ways with the family and then very distant in some ways with the family. One thing to be said about Cézanne's work, and one thing for you all to be looking for, is the idea of perception. Now, you and I both know that the brain takes visual imagery and it processes it, so that what we're seeing is something that occurs in our brain. It's a combination of the data in a painting, let's say, and then how the brain processes that data. Years later, artists will continue on with this line of thinking, but way back in the 19th century, Cézanne seems to have understood this intuitively. The eye must grasp, he says, bring things together, and the brain will give it shape. We know this is something that we find in cognition. We know that this is something Cézanne seems to have understood very well as a painter, and we should look for that as we work our way through. What you're looking at here is a very nice manor house in the south of France. It's a place that in 1859, Cézanne's father buys. It was built in about 1750. It was one-time home of the provincial governor. It's an amazing place with private gardens and ponds and fountains and sculptures. It's a very nice place to live. That same year, 1859, Cézanne began to study law at a university in Aix in order to appease his father. And he does so half-heartedly for about 2 years. Around the same time as he's studying law during the day, he begins to take evening courses at the École in Aix, located in the art museum in Aix, the Musée D'Orsay. 2 years later, in 1861, Cézanne gets up the courage to leave Aix for Paris. And if you're an artist in the middle of the 19th century, this is exactly where you want to be. Years later, Cézanne would return to the manor house in 1880, establishing an atelier up in the attic. He loved painting in the garden, especially because he had a view of Mont Sainte-Victoire, something that we'll see towards the end. But let's look at this at the beginning, because it's something to remember that if you live in a place like this, and if your family is wealthy enough to afford a place like this, it does help as an artist, especially as a kind of artist that Cézanne was. He wasn't trying to appease the general public. In fact, he eventually would get enough of an inheritance that he didn't really need to think about that kind of thing. As a young teenager in Aix in 1852, Cézanne met Émile Zola, who would go on to be one of the most important French writers of the 19th century. You no doubt will be familiar with Zola through the Dreyfus affair. Zola plays a very interesting role in the affair. He was brought to trial for libel for publishing a letter to the president and was convicted 2 weeks later. This led to him being sentenced to jail. He had his Legion of Honor removed. and he flees to England in order to get away from the jail time. He stays there until the cabinet falls. He continues to defend Dreyfus. And then 4 years after the letter was published, he dies from carbon monoxide poisoning, which has very suspicious roots to it. The letter publicly from Zola is this: the conviction of Alfred Dreyfus was based on false accusations of espionage and was a misrepresentation of justice. So it's always nice to think about some of the figures at the same time in the same place and their connection to each other. It was Zola who strongly encouraged Cézanne to leave the provincial town and go up to Paris. When he gets to Paris, he is very interested, like all artists would be, in attending the major art school, the École des Beaux-Arts, but it's not very easy to get into. And Cézanne was not granted admission to the École. Instead, he studies at the very famous, equally famous Académie Suisse, the Swiss Academy, founded by Martin-François Suisse, a former model of the great French painter Jacques-Louis David. We can see it in this photo here. It's not a large art school, but it has a large role in the mythology of 19th century art, and indeed the foundations for what would become modern art. There was only 3 rooms, one large enough to be the art studio. You could fit 80 stools and benches if more students needed to come in. The place itself was very modest, but the students that it attracted ended up becoming some of the most important of the century. The year Cézanne begins studying at the Swiss Academy, Courbet paints the portrait of Monsieur Suisse that you see here. There are so many notable students. We can start pretty much anywhere, but certainly Courbet, who attended in the 1840s, goes on to become a great realist. Camille Claudel, Corot, Daumier, Ingres, Manet, Monet, Delacroix, Pissarro. These are some of the household names of the century. Though Cézanne's time there was short-lived, it makes a major impact. He meets Monet there, for example, in 1861, and it puts him together with a group of artists that will change just about everything in French art. 1862, Cézanne left Aix again for Paris. He's back and forth in the early years. His father gives him 150 francs a month to go and pursue his dreams. This is the equivalent of about 1 month of median income in France at that time. Cézanne was rejected again from the École des Beaux-Arts and has some thinking to do. In his process of discernment about what kind of artist he wants to be, he ends up participating in the most famous exhibition in many ways of the 19th century, and that is the Salon des Refusés, the Refused, at the Grand Palais. This seals his fate as an artist that will embrace the innovation and the avant-garde rather than the traditions, although he still has one foot in either camp. The Refusés is interesting in its own right because it was the result of so many artists' work having been rejected from the official salons of Paris. And when you have so many artists rejected, there is a little bit of a political issue here where, let's say, the government isn't interested in your work. And this was in the middle of the 19th century, not the kind of thing that the government wanted to be focusing on. So they throw a bone to the more innovative artists and they give them the own salon, the Refused. When you join a Refused salon, you are publicly outing yourself as an artist that didn't get into the main salon. So it generally attracted artists like Cézanne who were okay with that designation. And it paves the way for the first Impressionist exhibition in 1874, only 11 years later. Cézanne participated in the first Impressionist show, and from 1876 to 1879, a few years after that first show, his works were continually rejected again by the official Salon. This meant that he was very happy to show again with the Impressionists, in their third exhibition in 1877. It's through all of this that Cézanne comes into contact with the Impressionists, some of the greatest artists, certainly in Paris at that time. He gets to know Monet and Renoir, and especially Camille Pissarro, in many ways, the paterfamilias of the Impressionist show. Here's a photo inside the first Impressionist exhibition. It would be an amazing show to put together today, 165 works that would be nearly impossible to do because these are some of the greatest Impressionist works. But that being said, it wasn't well received by the public. Though today we know these names, Monet, Renoir, and exhibitions about their work and about Impressionism tend to be blockbusters, in the 1870s, this certainly wasn't the case. This was considered a ragtag group of marginal artists going against what the grains of French art were all about. Even though Manet, one of the great artists of the time, and Cézanne weren't particularly tight. Manet actually referred to Cézanne as a mason who paints with a trowel, and that's not very nice. They were kindred spirits of a sort in terms of artistic rule breaking. Like Manet before him, Manet received the lion's share of attention from the Salon des Refusés because of the way his work was structured. Cézanne gets a lot of negative attention from his own submission of works and from his own work on view at the Impressionist show, including the work at the left, A Modern Olympia. What you're looking at is a comparison of Manet's Great Olympia at the right and Cézanne's at the left. And Cézanne is very conscious of appropriating Manet's Olympia here. It becomes a kind of continuum, a kind of historiography of the odalisque, the reclining female nude that Cézanne picks up on. Notice the white cloth underneath Cézanne's nude, a similar kind of white cloth that we find underneath Olympia at the right. Olympia was absolutely considered an affront to all of the great reclining nudes throughout history, and it made it very famous, so much so that it was even included in the Salon shortly after it was painted. One of the things that we can do to understand how Cézanne is looking at the great Manet, the great artist pushing things forward, is by looking at his own commentary. Here you are, put this somewhere on your work table. You must always have this before your eyes. It's a new order of painting, he says. Our Renaissance starts here. There's a pictorial truth in things. This rose and this white lead us to it by a path hitherto unknown to our sensibilities. Just effusive praise for Manet's Olympia. Cézanne wasn't alone. Any avant-garde artist, any of the innovators in Paris were looking at Olympia for inspiration. One of the reasons why is that Olympia changes what a reclining nude in odalisque was meant to look like. And it does so with reference to some of the important reclining nudes that artists would have been aware of, and certainly critics and viewers would have been aware of. Here at the left, the great Grande Odalisque, Ingres' version of the reclining nude from the early 19th century. Notice how Ingres sets his nude off somewhere out of Paris, and he underscores this with the tapestry, with the hookah at the right, with the peacock feather duster, with the head wrap that she's wearing, all to suggest that this is a kind of objectification of a woman that to his eyes made more sense if that woman was far away in a so-called exotic land. Now, today we have to think about this in terms of the problematic of that, of how culturally unsensitive that was for Ingres to do something like that. But Manet changes that completely and shows you a version of the odalisque very much in Paris, very much of his time. In fact, Manet knew the sitter here, Victorine Meurent, and many artists knew her. She is of her time in a way that's so different from the tradition. And as you go back through time, you'll notice that Ingres changed up the tradition himself. All artists will do this with this style. Ingres is borrowing from, in many ways, the prototype of the reclining nude, Titian's Venus of Urbino. And each and every generation will offer a different kind of version of this reclining nude. In addition to Manet, the next most important influence in Cézanne's early years would be Delacroix. Delacroix dies in 1863, the year of the Salon des Refusés, in a kind of passing of the torch, a kind of moment when artists had to decide, were they going toward tradition or were they going towards the avant-garde? Here, Fantin Latour's famous image, the homage to Delacroix, with none other than Manet, with the red hair and beard, positioned just to the right of that image. It shows just how much he was seen as a leader for a whole host of reasons. One of the reasons is that Delacroix is the kind of artist that is taking great liberties with color, especially. Delacroix dared to make a kind of surface texture that revealed brushwork. This was something that was not done in the early 19th century, certainly not by his great contemporary Ingres. And Delacroix does this very consciously and moves away from the idea that a painting ought to look like something quasi-photographic, like a window on the world. In fact, Delacroix wants it to be both a narrative and something that'll tell a story, like the story of the death of Sardanapalus here, the Assyrian ruler from antiquity, but also something that exists as its own object, as exists in terms of a celebration of composition and color and brushwork. In so many ways, this becomes one of the roots towards modernism. Here, Cézanne is paying his own homage to the great Delacroix. We can see Delacroix's self-portrait at the right and how Cézanne picks up on some of those facial features and some of those qualities of the artist. He is, like Manet, like so many artists of the generation, absolutely enamored by Delacroix. Delacroix's paintings, he said, it's iridescent. And he has a sense of human being, of life in movement, of warmth. Everything moves, everything even glistens. This is the kind of language that you might feel more comfortable using when talking about late 19th century work or modernist work, where it does seem to move, where it does seem to have a kind of glistening effect from the texture. Delacroix gets there very early. Cézanne goes on to say, Delacroix is the greatest palette of France, and no one beneath our skies possessed to a greater extent than he both the serene and the pathetic, the vibration of color. We all paint through him. The vibration of color. Again, this is the kind of language that artists and critics didn't use before Delacroix. And certainly there were artists like Goya that painted a bit more painterly and some others to put in that category. But it was Delacroix who really cements this idea. And now we have a one-way street heading towards modernism. Cézanne's first decade as a painter shows that he's a bit like a Janus type figure, at once looking forward into the more innovations and also looking backward, looking at artists that preceded him, looking at artists even considered the old masters. We know when he first is in Paris, he's running around the Louvre like every other artist, trying to learn from the old masters and in fact copying from the old masters. This is what makes Cézanne so interesting. He's breaking the rules, but in some ways from within. He's critiquing the systems of art, but as an internal critique. This is something that explains his very famous quote, I wanted to make of Impressionism something solid and enduring, like the art in museums. And as we saw with Impressionism that was universally detested by the critics, the first show, this is where Cézanne comes in. He wants to be a bit of a bridge between the innovators and the traditions. And we can see this in some of his earliest works. At the left, this lovely drawing at Cambridge, and of course, even in the painting at the right. This is someone interested in anatomy, interested in rendering the body in a quasi-classical way, akin to, say, the Renaissance artist. He's even showing the nude figure at the left, which is something that becomes the absolute standard in some ways of Italian Renaissance art. Cézanne is looking forward and he's looking backward at the same time. Eventually, Cézanne does get a painting accepted at the Salon, but not because it's considered an amazing work. The Salon rejected Cézanne's submissions every year from 1864 to 69. He does keep trying, and over his works are rejected. Eventually, he gets a coveted spot in 1882 with this portrait, the portrait of his father, Louis-Auguste Cézanne. The reason that this happened is because of his connection to the landscape painter Jean-Baptiste Antoine Guillaumet. They become friends, and the landscape painter becomes a judge, a juror, and a member of the Salon, and then pulls his friend in for this one and only time, the portrait of the artist's father. It's a good opportunity to talk about Cézanne's father. This is someone who considered art impractical. He was someone that was very different from Cézanne, and they had a very emotionally charged relationship, tense relationship that in some ways we can see in the portrait through all the choppy brushwork and all the frenetic imagery. In the early 1860s, Cézanne rejected his legal and banking career, one set out by his father, for art. Cézanne felt that painting was a kind of physical manifestation in some ways. And here we have this declaration of independence from his father. Cézanne's father is a banker who is very successful financially and who will eventually play a major role, reluctantly, in helping Cézanne along. This idea of a seated singular figure is something that we see throughout Cézanne's career. Here's one of many, many examples at the right, the great seated peasant at the Met in New York. This is a sitter who probably posed for Cézanne's very famous card players. This is a painting that in some ways is very interesting in its own way. There's a very complex space behind the figure. It's a rather L-shaped room. The chair is directly frontal. The wainscoting at the left of the figure, close to the viewer, is closer to us than it should be, considering what's happening on the right side of the painting, where space seems to be a little more distant from the viewer. And so Cézanne is playing with this idea that a painting doesn't have to be an actual copy of the real world. Even in the background, even in architecture, he's toying with the idea of challenging us. What we think we see is not always, in fact, what the data is showing. And that points to Cézanne's interest in this kind of cognitive perception of art. We assume that all is good in the world when we look at these images, but when we look a little bit more closely, sometimes the details don't add up. Cézanne will continue to use this seated figure pose throughout his career. Here are two more examples, one in Texas and one in Oslo. He will also bring the female figure into this seated solitary pose and continue to play some interesting tricks with the architecture and the space in the background. And he does so especially through Madame Cézanne. In the late 1860s, Cézanne is back and forth between Paris and Aix. And in 1869 in Paris, he met Marie Hortense Fiquet Cézanne. She was at the Swiss Academy. She was a bookbinder and a model. She was 11 years younger than Cézanne. They would eventually get married in 1886, but their relationship, by all accounts in the scholarship, is not one of true love, let's say. And we can have some fun seeing this through these portraits. Just look at the expression that she wears in just about every one of the portraits of her. Cézanne was notoriously shy and didn't like to be touched. Some of this stemmed from a rather tragic incident when he was a boy, an altercation with a classmate, and he carried that with him throughout his life and no doubt throughout his relationship with Madame Cézanne. He felt generally uncomfortable around people and models for this reason. And so we find that he goes back to her as a model that no doubt he's comfortable being around and paints her repeatedly. In fact, 26 portraits of her between 1872 and 94. She's the person most often painted by Cézanne. We can see in these images something of his personality, something of his biography, certainly his distaste for physical intimacy. You and I, as we are looking at these pictures, probably don't feel particularly connected to her through her expressions, maybe even her body language. And this was a mirror to the way Cézanne felt about her. Her disposition, sour. She failed to smile. She refused to ingratiate herself to him or, in turn, to us. She's remote. She's distant. She rarely engages with the viewer. Here are two more examples of this kind of very distant relationship between the viewer and sitters. In so many ways, these kind of images show that Cézanne's relationship with her was a kind of complicated one, especially in terms of artist and muse. She's a bit like a counter muse. And even when not painting her, he seems to have suggested some of this. We know she was an uncooperative helpmate to him. She never really understood him or his work. She didn't like his paintings. She preferred city life to the provinces, and they spent a lot of time apart. As you've already seen with the complexities of the relationship with his father, we see some of those same complexities with the relationship with her. Perhaps the pressures of a major war dampened some of the initial spark between Cézanne and Ficquet. Not long after they got together, in 1869, the Franco-Prussian War breaks out between the Second Empire French and the North German Confederation led by the Kingdom of Prussia. It goes on from mid-1870 to the beginning of 1871. And in so many ways, it's undergirded by France's goal to restore European leadership following Prussia's victory over Austria in 1866. France mobilized its army first. It invades Germany, and the Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck deliberately provoked the French into declaring war on Prussia. German forces were at that time superior, embracing modernity with railways and artillery, and the war ends in Germany's favor. And all of this is happening as a backdrop when Impressionism is about to take fold, when Cézanne is learning how to be an artist. These are some of his first years in Paris. Sometimes we forget some of those social issues and how they affect everyone involved. Due to the war in 1871, Cézanne and Ficquet left Paris together for the lovely small village of L'Estaque down on the Mediterranean coast, just west of Marseille and just south of his hometown of Aix. He was considered a deserter for having done this. Few details in the scholarship remain that explore that aspect of his life. L'Estaque remains one of his favorite places throughout his career to paint. He paints there with Renoir in 1882, Monet in 1883, and we see images of this provincial fishing town over and over. He liked the country. He was from a small town and preferred it to city life. In the 1870s, he wrote this letter from L'Estaque, and he said, "I fancy the country where I am and would suit you marvelously well. It's like a playing card, red roofs against the blue sea. It's olive trees and pines which always keep their leaves. The sun here is so frightful that it seems to me the objects are silhouetted not only in white and black, but in blue, red, brown, violet. I could be wrong, he says, but it seems to me that this is the opposite of modeling, a place that absolutely takes over his imagination. At the left, one of the views of the Lestock water that paves the way for more of his modernist views of the Lestock water, like at the right. At the right in the Chicago picture, you get a sense that the blue of the water is its own character in the story. The blue is not a leitmotif in the landscape. It's the primary plot line here, with the mountains above the water and the village just below at the bottom left in the Chicago picture, kind of standing as satellites surrounding the water. If you look closely in person, really put your nose up to this painting, if you are in Chicago or see this on view somewhere, you'll see that that water is just a big color field of blue. And it's these larger areas of pure color that inspire some of the modern artists almost a century later in their very flattened uses of color. Of course, the war ends. The Treaty of France was signed May 10th, 1871. It brought German unifications. The Germans received billions of francs in war indemnity, and most of Alsace and parts of Lorraine. Certainly is very interesting roads away from that discussion. Germany replaces France as the dominant power in Europe. The Franco-Prussian War was over, and Paris rejoiced. Artists moved back. In some ways, the Parisian art community gets a reset and doubles down as a place for all things innovative in terms of the arts. This led to the return of Cézanne and Ficquet to Paris. This is May 1871, and 8 months later, they welcome their son, Paul, born in January 1872. Because of that complex relationship between Cézanne and his father, he kept the baby a secret initially, fearing that his father would cut off his allowance. But in 1878, this is only 6 years later, Cézanne's father finds out about the boy. He does initially cut off the allowance, but finally relents, even building for Cézanne in the early 80s a studio at his manor home that we saw at the very beginning, a very nice place for him to work. By all accounts, his marriage in 1886, when the boy was 14, was not out of love, but to secure the inheritance rights for the boy. They were quite unhappy together, Cézanne and Ficquet, by the time that they were married. Cézanne's father died the same year that they were married, and this meant that Cézanne had a fairly substantial inheritance and part of the manor estate that changes the course of his life from then on. We can see some of the qualities of Cézanne as a personality, some of the distaste with socializing, some of the uncomfortability with his relationship in images of his son. Certainly, these are images that would immediately make you think of the melancholic, this hand on your face, this forlorn kind of expression. Melancholia was in antiquity considered one of the four temperaments, along with sanguine, choleric, and phlegmatic personalities. And each of these corresponded to your astrological sign. And of course, each of your astrological signs correspond to the four elements: earth, air, fire, water. All of this was laid out either in ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia, but finally codified in ancient Greece, as I'm sure you are aware, by the Greek physician Hippocrates. This is around 400 BCE. The melancholic temperament was for some time linked to creative genius, certainly since the Renaissance, when images like Dürer's famous Melancholic made brooding very fashionable. Many artists even lied about their birthday so that they could be born under a sign governed by the melancholic temperament. If you are interested in any of this, still a very fun book to read is Born Under Saturn. Saturn was the planet that guarded the melancholic temperament, by the great Rudolf and Margot Wittkover from 1963. It explores all the twists and turns of the melancholic temperament in the arts. We find this melancholic pose throughout Cézanne's work, certainly in the Russian picture at the left and in a host of pictures. If you know where to look, you will find Cézanne's interest in the melancholic. And it's very easy to make the leap that he himself was a melancholic and his life was full of complex relationships. His art wasn't terribly embraced by the general public until after his death, and all of that contributes to it. But the second picture from the left, the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, the picture that you see here is particularly interesting because it shows his classic melancholic, again, with the associations of melancholia, especially throughout the past centuries in art. But it shows this melancholic with a skull. In 1890, Cézanne was diagnosed with diabetes. This made him even more cantankerous and even warier of socializing. And we can make some sense of his use of skulls in the context of his deteriorating physical health and, in turn, his deteriorating mental health. Cézanne had been depicting skulls from the very beginning of his career, all the way back. We're looking at 1866 in one of the earliest phases of his career. And he will continue to do so all the way through the rest of the career. When one sees skulls used this often in art or at all, the first thing that should come to mind is the idea of the memento mori, the Latin phrase, remember you are mortal. Artists have been attracted to the memento mori and have used skulls for a long, long time. This was the kind of imagery that reminded viewers that life is brief and that death is inevitable. And while we are all here and awake and alert and alive and learning about Cézanne, we remember this reality. These are the kind of paintings that would, or were meant to, jolt you back to living in your own skin at that very moment, being present, we say nowadays, the kind of carpe diem that we see throughout the centuries. This quality of bringing a skull in a painting to get us to feel the moment is something that we find especially during the Dutch Golden Age, after the 1648 independence from Spain. Around 1640, the Dutch East India Company had a trade monopoly with Japan, making Amsterdam among the most important ports in the 17th century. This led to lots of trade, a lot of prosperity, a lot of science, a lot of art. This happening whilst the push away from Roman Catholicism is happening under the Reformation, which meant that images of religious figures, saints, and the like were considered inappropriate by the Protestants. So in Holland, we find this tradition of suggesting a kind of morality or a kind of religious or spiritual ethics through some of these images of the memento mori. At the left, you're looking at one of these great still lifes that shows you the quill pen and the book, all of this to suggest that knowledge is not something you can take with you after death, that riches that one would find all the way through prosperity in the Dutch Golden Age are something that exists only in this life. And so these were reminders to not get too caught up in that kind of thing, not to get too focused on these kind of trappings of prosperity. Cézanne continues this tradition of skulls. Certainly at the right, we can see this. And we can see him doing some of the same things as some of these traditional images. Both of these on the screen suggest the subject in art called Vanitas. That's Latin for vanity. Again, reminders of the preciousness of life and the futility of pleasure and the certainty of death. The warning to think about death, even in your youth. And if you think this was only a Dutch Golden Age idea that Cézanne resurrected, think again, because we find this rearing its head even in our own most innovative contemporary art, including very famously in Damien Hirst's for the Love of God at the right from 2007. This is the combination of about 8,600 flawless diamonds, about 1,100 carats, that are put on an actual human skull bought in a shop in England of a European skull from around 1720 to 1810. We know that Hirst is thinking about other cultures and their traditions of using skulls, going all the way back to Tezcatlipoca, something he would have seen at the British Museum. This idea of a mosaic mask, something that suggests a certain amount of power and transience and the brevity of life. At the left, this is something made with turquoise. Beautiful color, but not a stone that has as much value now as diamonds, but it held an enormous amount of value for those who made it. And this means that Hirst is building in this critique of why we value certain things. Why do we value diamonds when we don't value turquoise the same way? It's a kind of question of money and value are only afforded based on who's ascribing that value to them. Maybe one day diamonds won't be valuable, and maybe they'll go the way of turquoise. And this is something that Hirst gets us to think about. Hirst very famously, I'm sure you are aware, put animals in tanks like the physical impossibility of death in the mind of someone living in order to get to the heart of how reluctant we are to think about death. And even when we meet a shark in a tank like this, we see this become even more of a topic. Still lifes like these have been around for a long, long time, using animal and animal imagery. We see Peter Artsen's meat still life that suggested this. We find Rembrandt's still life that followed it. And we can start to see Cézanne become very interested in this kind of still life, bringing foods together in order to focus on the present. In some ways, still lives like these by Cézanne are linked very directly to works like this by Caravaggio, the famous still life with a basket of fruit, the kind of imagery that is very much about recognizing the present. At the left, this is a basket of fruits that are absolutely in their prime. They're even perspiring. You can see the sweat on some of these beautiful, luscious, delicious, healthy fruits. So much so that Caravaggio is showing you a reality. Yes, these fruits are perfect now, but they will rot. And this becomes a mirror of what happens to all living things. Things once in their prime, through a series of entropic processes, will wind down and will evolve into something else. But here they're frozen in time, frozen for their perfection. Fruit becomes something that Cézanne uses repeatedly in his still lives. It's kind of a mythic symbol for him in so many ways. He paints 100 compositions with apples, for example, knowing that fruits like apples and oranges have all kinds of associations, some mythic, some erotic, especially in terms of the Garden of Eden, some metaphysical, and also fruit allowed him to play with form, transforming a sphere to a circle, for example. This is one way Cézanne is starting to manipulate nature and to double down on that idea that what we see in a painting is not always what our brain tells us what we see through perception. At the left, everything sits on the table as is, and we're certainly fine with that. But at the right, notice how the table is tipped in such a way that everything seems like it would just slide right off that table. But was that the first thing you noticed when you saw it? Maybe. But for a lot of us, we project onto the image what we assume that it is. We assume it's a still life with everything situated as it should be on the table. And we forget to read the actual data in front of us, that actually all these objects would slide right off the table. And we can see this even with the green jug at the right in the Los Angeles picture, where we're looking over at the jug, but also looking down into it, into the lip of the jug. The lip becomes tipped up towards us. This is not how a jug works. We shouldn't be able to look over and down into something at the same time. And it's this kind of what Cézanne called passage that changes the narrative of what's real and what can only exist in a painting. Cézanne was very close to nature. Cézanne will think about nature throughout his career. Nature is always the same, he says, and yet its appearance is always changing. We see some of that in the still lives. Painting must give us the flavor of nature's eternity, everything you understand. So I join together nature's straying hands, he says, from all sides, here, there, and everywhere. I select colors, tones, and shades. I set them down, I bring them together. They make lines, they become objects, rocks and trees, without my thinking about them. But if there is the slightest distraction, he says, the slightest hitch, above all, if I interpret too much one day, if I'm carried away today by a theory which contradicts yesterday's, if I think while I'm painting, if I meddle, then whoosh, everything goes to pieces. And so he's thinking of nature in terms of his still lives. He's also thinking of nature philosophically, thinking of himself as a kind of conduit of nature, something that foreshadows something Jackson Pollock said in the middle of the 20th century. I am nature, Pollock said. He just let nature come through him and out him. This is a quote from Cézanne to a letter to Zola. Do you remember the pine on the bank of the river Arc, with its hairy head projecting above the abyss at its foot? This pine, which protected our bodies with its foliage from the heat of the sun, oh, may the gods preserve it from the woodman's baleful axe. He's looking at nature in some ways metaphorically. The tree here becomes a kind of mirror of the existential individual, a kind of individual shaped by cosmic forces. Notice how this is one solitary, strong tree in the setting, underscoring a kind of romantic view of an individual connecting with nature, something that we find around the same time in America in literature with the American transcendentalist writer and this quest for uniqueness and individuality. When we think of this kind of brooding with nature in the romantic sense, we can look at this lovely verse written in 1863. The days we went to the meadows near Tours to eat a good lunch and palette in hand, trace on canvas a luxuriant landscape, whereas today the plants along the brook are withered, and the tree, battered by furious winds, stirs its stripped branches in the air, an immense cadaver that the mistral swings. Here's another poem along similar lines. The tree, shaken by the fury of the winds, stirs its stripped branches in the air, an immense cadaver that the mistral swings. We can find references to Cézanne's love of nature in so many places, certainly in his work, but in his relationships. One of the figures in his life that at one point Cézanne paints, Joachim Gasquet, has this to say. He loved trees. Toward the end, with his need for sustained solitude, an olive tree becomes his friend. The tree's wisdom entered his heart. It's a living being, he said to me one day. I love it like an old colleague. I'd like to be buried at its feet. Cézanne, in some ways, is more connected to nature than to the people around him. And we can sense his preference for solitude in pictures like this, for example, without any reference to nature. The figures are playing cards, but they stare off into space, and they do so incommunicatively. Cézanne preferred to be alone. He preferred to be with nature. And that's what brings us to one of the great series of his career, the series of Mont Sainte-Victoire, an 11-mile mountain ridge with exposed white limestone cliffs over the Arc River Valley just east of Aix. It's about 3,300 feet tall, so it's not the greatest mountain in the world, but it's one that becomes so important in the history of modern art because Cézanne painted it repeatedly. He could see it from his house. And for someone who preferred solitude, it was his perfect subject. He could analyze it, let's say, from a distance, taking in all of its shapes. As we work our way through the series, at the left, the 1880s, and then working our way forward into the 1890s and even into the 20th century, we'll see how Cézanne uses the mountain to develop a new visual language. Over and over, he paints the same subject, but it allows him to change his style. And eventually, he ends up in the last images of Mont Sainte-Victoire, making the most abstracted kinds of images. These are, let's say, the least quasi-photographic of the series. He begins with more direct copies of them, and he evolves here. And this place that he evolves right before his death is interesting because it finally shows what he's been trying to communicate all along, that we viewers are guilty of projecting onto a painting what we assume it's supposed to be, rather than stopping and spending some time with it and looking at it for what it actually is. And the detail at the right illustrates this a little bit. Here is a detail of the horizon line that separates the landscape from the mountain. And when you see it up close, you realize immediately that there really is no separation from the mountain and the land, and therefore from the background and the foreground. Everything exists on one flattened plane, the two-dimensional plane of the canvas. And it's here in so many ways that modernism begins, because modernism in so many respects is a recognition that painting is its own reality, that the two-dimensional surface ought to be honored rather than attempts to make it more perspectival. Artists will come after Cézanne and they will pick up this branch and continue running with it. As we've seen with portraits of his seated male figures, portraits of his wife, portraits of Mont Sainte-Victoire, there certainly is a comfort in Cézanne in doing things repeatedly. Henri Matisse knew this. Although the Master of X ceaselessly redid the same painting, don't we come upon a new Cézanne with the greatest curiosity? It didn't matter that he did the same series repeatedly. It allowed him to find a subject and develop a new visual language around it. Cézanne's interest in the bathers underscores his interest in series. Over and over, he paints them, including some of his most famous works, the large bathers that he makes very much at the end of his life, a kind of culmination for him of so many things that he's been working on for some time, a kind of culmination of thinking about a new visual language. Here, the very famous Philadelphia bathers. When Cézanne dies in 1906, he dies having been outside. He loses consciousness. He ends up becoming hypothermic, getting pneumonia, and he dies shortly thereafter. Immediately, it becomes clear that the younger generation of artists is with him. And the year after his death in 1907, there is a major retrospective of his works in Paris at the Autumn Salon. And it's there that so many of the young generation sees his works. Matisse and Picasso famously, who says Cézanne is the father of us all. This is the legacy of the great Cézanne. He is, in many ways, the father of modernist art. Picasso even bought a chateau near Mont Sainte-Victoire and is buried there in order to honor this legacy. Cézanne becomes one of the bridges between mid-19th century and early 20th century art, and artists, even today, are still thinking about his legacy.